Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I'm super excited to have Meredith Noble on the podcast with me today. Welcome, Meredith.
Hello, hello.
So I would love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about your company, Learn Grant Writing, and what you guys do, and also what the journey was like to get you to the point where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so at Learn Grant Writing, we're known for the Global Grant Writers Collective. It's an online community for those that are moving into grant writing, whether that's freelancing or within their role at a nonprofit. And so we have a course, community group, and coaching program that's absolutely unbeatable. I feel so lucky that the people that are in that program all feel like friends. You're like, where are these people been all my life? Like, you didn't know that there were other people out there like you. So that's what the collective is. And then in terms of how I fell into it, completely accidentally, I graduated in the economic recession in 2008, could not find work, and started doing all of these informational interviews, which is a different style of meeting with people where you're really curious, you're really trying to understand, do they have a problem I can solve? And that led to falling into grant writing. And I discovered I loved it because you get to be navigating the triangle between the funder, your organization you're working with, and maybe technical staff, because I was doing that for an engineering firm. Fast forward, offered a job, worked full-time as a grant writer at an engineering firm that grew to 22,000 employees in the time I was there. So obviously, wow. If you're helping get funding for your infrastructure clients, every project manager wanted me on their team, which was great. But I was like very young in my 20s, working so hard, and I burned out. And so I left pledging to never write another grant again. And the message here is never say never is actually a true statement, right? And fast forward, I quit my job to launch the sexy startup when I basically realized that just because you have an idea doesn't mean you have an underlying business model, which is probably something we can get into later. And so I started consulting because that was what I knew how to do, and people wanted that expertise. And often people would say, can I get you a cup of coffee or buy you lunch? I want to learn all about grants. And the reality is I cannot give you everything you need over a cup of coffee. And that was what led to, hey, what if I turned this into a course? And of course, you know how this goes, that actually there was years of failure, or what looked like success, but was actually not success before we finally got it right. And then that has been the journey of the Global Grant Writing Collective in the last 2 years.
Oh, that's amazing. So does your company now write grants for nonprofits, or not at all? You're supporting grant writers who write grants.
We did. So what happened was when COVID-19 hit and CARES Act money was flowing, we were getting 5 to 10 requests a week to write grants. And so I ended up hiring. I'd only launched my course like 4 months before. I ended up hiring a bunch of my students to go after these grants, some of which had just joined, like they weren't even through the content yet, but I thought they looked promising. And so that was obviously insanity of trying to write millions of dollars of federal grant proposals while also running a course business. And so that's when I brought in, who is now my co-founder, Alex. And Alex is a project manager extraordinaire. And so she really managed the team, making all the processes that are in my head, putting them into a project management software, and just executing on a really high level. And our students that were in the course, the ones that we loved the most, they were asking, how are you charging? How are you managing contracting? Like, they wanted to know how we were making money as grant writers, not just how to write grants. And so fast forward, we do close down consulting because it's hard to split your brain and go all in on the course. But at that point, we actually, in December of 2020, we lost 25 grand alone that month. And you can't live on your consulting savings that long before you run out of runway, right? And so it was definitely a rock bottom moment, especially up here in Alaska. December is dark, right?
Literally, yes.
Literally dark. You don't know what to do. But when we decided to really focus on who is that specific person that we get a ton of energy working with, how do we build, at the time for her, now we're getting a ton of great men, but at the time we really narrowed, uncomfortably narrow, right? And that was the moment that was a complete turning point. So we've taken a few consulting projects to where I can teach what I'm learning through the process with my members. But at this point, I've got 500 of them providing me active consulting examples in every coaching call. So I feel plenty kept up to speed without having to have my own workload on top of that.
Oh my gosh. That's amazing. So your members are grant writers. Like you said, some are freelance and some work in-house at a nonprofit. Um, so are you finding like after they sort of graduate through your course, do they stay with you? Is it like a membership concept or do they sort of like graduate and then, go on to run their business empires?
Oh, 100%. So I think about it this way. Who built the business of their dreams in 1 year? Do you know anyone? I don't
Nope, 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 nope.
either. It's a journey, new levels, new devils. And
Mhm.
the biggest thing I find we have to continually break through are new mindset barriers. And so
Mhm.
knowing that, we think of it more as a 3-year program, as if you were going to get your
Mm.
master's and you're going through different levels. So once you've made $35,000 in revenue, you unlock this whole other section of content that's about hiring and how do you actually give yourself benefits, like the business skills that sometimes can be so elusive. And so that we have people who have been with me literally from the very beginning. So they've been around for 3 years at this point. And I think there'll come probably a point for some of them where it's like, okay, you're ready to go find a new guru that can be your advisor and your coach. But for now, we have found that until you've hit 250K in revenue, or you feel like you're peak at your job, like you're not done, because that's what makes grant writing so beautiful, is that you're never done learning. And if you are, you're probably bored and not enjoying it and looking for a pivot anyway, because that's who we are as people, right? We
Mhm.
really love to learn. So yeah, I think of it more as a MBA, so more of a 3-year program that you're going through, but you only have a 1-year commitment. So if people feel a little scared about that because they haven't written grants before or whatever, it's like, hey, it's not like a college that you've just committed years and years of your life to if you don't even know you're going to like that career path.
I love that. I like the way of thinking of that. And there's really something to be said for staying with the same coach or the same program for multiple years rather than like coach hopping or program hopping, which I see in like the entrepreneurial space. I see that happen all the time. It's like, okay, I just did this person's program. I just went on that person's retreat. Now I'm going to join this mastermind. And it's like, well, why don't we stick with one thing for a little while and like see how far we can take this, like you said, kind of until you hit a certain level, until you're starting to outgrow it. And that's one thing I don't see a lot in the nonprofit sector is nonprofit leaders like investing in themselves and then sticking with it for a period of time. But it sounds like you have members in your program that work inside nonprofits. So like it's happening, just not, I feel like it's just not widespread. What do you think is maybe like different about those people that are working inside a nonprofit that are in your program committed to their development over a long period of time?
I'd say that many of them that are within a nonprofit sometimes do struggle to get their membership paid for year after year. They can get it paid for the first year without too much trouble. But the problem is there's this thought that, okay, I've invested in you, you have everything you need. This sense of staticness, this sense that you're done, you've learned, I've invested in you, so now you
Yes.
give back to me. And
Yeah.
the unfortunate fallacy in all of that is that you're never done. They're always going to be encountering new challenges. And if your employee is not held and supported, they will leave your organization.
Hmm.
And so one of the best ways, and frankly, paying to give someone educational support is cheaper than a higher compensation package in terms of how they will feel. Like if you look at the reward that, or how an employee feels when they're supported in their job.
Hmm.
Right. And that's what keeps someone. That's what also allows them to keep succeeding. Like they have at this point, especially if they've been with you for a while, so much institutional knowledge. If you lose that, it's more than a loss in the salary or the bottom line. Like it can take months, if not even years, to get someone back to where they were. Right. So I do
Hmm.
think that can be sometimes a little bit of a struggle because there's this sense that, yeah, you're done. And there is no such thing as done. And if there was, you probably don't want that employee.
Yeah. Yeah, you're so right. It's like, okay, you check the box, now perform for us. Now like go do your thing and make the return on our investment. And you're right. So I love that you have people in your program whose organizations do value their
Absolutely.
investment in them. I think that's so important. And I just think your point about that, like for everybody listening, your development, your professional, your personal development is never done. And it is always a worthwhile investment. And I think especially for those people like me that like to crunch the numbers, that are like, okay, wait a second, this is, but the benefit of that is a greater benefit than, like you said, even paying someone a higher salary. So I love that.
Right. And the other thing that I didn't expect to be a catching point for the nonprofits was the ones that are really enthusiastic about paying for someone in their organization to be getting trained within the collective is the realization that they're not actually just paying for one person, their employee. They're actually paying for 6 coaches. They're paying for 500 peer mentors. So they're realizing that, wait a minute, we're gaining, almost like that person is the funnel and the gateway to so much more capacity, because no one person can know it all. And so our nonprofits that get that fact, they're the ones that have no trouble with investing in it for years, because they realize, wow, like we get so much more than this one person when we have that much expertise backing them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's such a good selling point. Yeah, because I've struggled with that. Like, I just remember in my own career working inside a nonprofit, wanting to go to like a professional development course specifically about nonprofit accounting. And I remember getting pushback for months. Like, I'd have it on my one-on-one, like my check-in sheet with my supervisor for months. And it was always like, we'll talk about it next month. We'll talk about it next quarter. And I'm just like, this is like $700. And this organization is like $15 million. Why are we even having this conversation? And as a result, how did that make me feel? Like, I did not feel like I was valued at all. You can't spend $700 to help me do my job better. Like,
Right. Exactly.
So yeah, so that's, I love that about your company and about the people that you have in your collective. That's awesome. I wanted to talk to you about grants, since that is your expertise. And you said earlier, before we had started recording, that grants are the icing on the cake, not the cake. Did I get it right?
Yes.
And tell me more about that. What does that mean?
I always use the analogy that writing grants is like baking a cake, because if you follow a recipe, right, that's what a grant narrative looks like. Whether we're talking about a federal grant that's super complicated, which would be a complicated cake with meringue on top, or are we talking cake mix, which is a simpler application, right? But they do all follow the same rhythm and cycle. But one place that we find people get into trouble, particularly our newer nonprofits, is when they're looking for grants to sustain the organization and provide for ongoing operational costs. Now, it's not to say that grants can't pay for staff at times in creative ways, because your staff are the reason you can implement programs. Without them, the program wouldn't happen. So that is a cost that directly correlates to a grant application that you might be applying for. But the rule of thumb that we advise is that a grant is no more than 20% of your overall budget. I'd love your opinion on this. You're the numbers gal, but that's generally where we want to land. And if you think about this like a cake, we have about 20% is frosting, right? 20% is that delicious cream cheese frosting on the carrot cake, which is your very viable, sustainable financial model underpinning your nonprofit. The cake tastes good whether it has frosting or not, right? Mm-hmm. The frosting is just that extra bit that really sweetens the deal.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So you're saying one grant, not like the bucket of grants that maybe there's like 30 different grants. You're saying one grant should not comprise more than 20% of revenue.
I'm saying all of your grants, your whole grant portfolio should not make up more than, if we're looking at your 100%, your entire annual budget, your whole budget, we only want about 20% of that at most to be made up of grants. So if we have a $1 million budget, around $200,000 could be grant funded. And part of the reason for that is that when you're applying for grants, they are going to ask, what is your operating budget? For one, they're going to want to know what size you are. And it's very hard for you and so it's easier to get grants once you start getting to a larger budget, because it's proving that you have some stability, right? And it's going to be nearly impossible as you get to a certain size. Like you mentioned, you were working for a nonprofit that had 15 million in revenue. How does a $15 million in revenue business run on grants alone? That volatility would just be unreal. because there's no guarantee you're getting grants year after year after year from the same programs, right? So that's because there is that inherent fluctuating, I don't know, that it fluctuates a little bit, right? Like what grants you get, new programs come online, others are retiring and you're moving on. So it just can't provide that base stability that we need for your operations to be sustainable and secure and all the things that you talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But I welcome
Yeah,
your opinion on that. If you have it, I mean, it's not to say, like I said, this is an average. So there might be people that are 50% grant funded or more, but maybe there's a little smaller of an organization, right? And I get that, but it's sort of looking at from an average perspective. I just don't want someone rolling in thinking their whole operation should be 100% grant funded, because that suggests to me you don't actually have a sustainable business model. And yes, a nonprofit has a business model.
Mm-hmm.
And if we
Yeah.
don't have that, it's going to make even writing your grant applications harder. Like that's something that's being looked at more closely by funders now than ever, because there's this realization that a lot of money has been spent that hasn't really had the impact that was promised or anticipated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So as you're saying this, I'm definitely thinking of like, because obviously I've seen behind the scenes financials of hundreds of nonprofit organizations. And so I can think of examples where, I'm thinking of one organization who one federal grant comprised like 60 or 70% of their entire revenue. And the federal funder was like, we're not doing this anymore. We're not funding you at this level. So we're going to fund you less and less. And you got to go find money elsewhere. We can't be the like main source of revenue, keeping this organization alive, basically. And so, yeah, I definitely I've seen that side of things. Then I'm thinking of another organization where they're about $9 or $10 million. And I would say probably 7 million of that is from their grant portfolio. But then within that grant portfolio, they have probably like 50 grants, 5 figures up to 7 figures, and they're all spanning multiple years. And so in that case, like definitely more than 20% is coming from their grant portfolio, but their grant portfolio itself is so diverse that like, to me, that still is very strong. Now, if that grant portfolio were 7 of the 10 million and like 3 grants, then that would be definitely much more reason for concern. But because they have a deep portfolio within it, I'm like, okay, well, that's working for them while they're also actively trying to build other revenue streams. So it's very interesting, but I think the common message for all of our listeners is that like, don't put all your eggs in one basket. We really need like a diverse portfolio of revenue that we're not relying on just one source, whether it's grants or something else to sustain us. Because at the end of the day, the grants go away. Like they go away. You may not be renewed. You may not get that funding again. And then what? You're kind of starting over again. So I love that you're teaching that to your grant writers who then are bringing that back to their organizations or their clients that they're working for, to make sure that the organization is also not thinking, oh, this grant writer is going to be responsible for like all of our revenue. Just doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and Stephanie, that kicked loose a thought that I'd love to share, which is the importance of a funding strategy, which I'm going to separate right now, grants and fundraising. So I'm not going to talk about the fundraising side because I actually think that's a very different skill set and personality type. A more outward facing extrovert and grant writers, we can actually be decently introverted and behind the scenes, right? So can be a different person. So I'm talking about a funding strategy for the grants. This was a methodology I developed when I was working at those engineering firms, and infrastructure projects are multi-million dollars. No one grant is going to pay for it. And so I had to figure out, how do I layer in which grants at what timing to help win the next one before you spend one, so you can use it as leverage so that we can secure the entire 5 million needed or whatever. And that formed the basis of what I now call the funding strategy, which is looking ahead. It's a roadmap for the next 12 to 18 months of what grants you're going to pursue that have the highest likelihood of success and return on investment in terms of your resources put in to get it. And I don't see this often enough, because there's too much reaction to the grants out, go. And that leads to a ton of burnout for poor grant writers that are in this very reactionary mode. And so the way we can reverse that to not be in a haphazard approach to grants is to like put a pin in things for a moment, look forward, plan which ones you're going to use. So one grant always helps you win the next one. I think of them like dominoes. if your dominoes are too far apart and one knocks over, it's going to have no effect on the next domino. Whereas if they're close, we can really send that domino, I don't know, lineup flowing, right? And so I just want to emphasize that that's a really important tool for your listeners to start investigating and learning about if they don't have that, so that you're not in that situation where you've ran out of the money from grants or they didn't get renewed. Like, you're not going to be vulnerable like that.
Yeah, that's so good. And I've definitely like seen organizations think about their overall like funding strategy related to fundraising and grant writing, but it's more like, okay, grants, we're going to bring in like $1 million from grants, and then that's it. And then, like you said, it's very reactive and it's just constantly chasing money. But I love this idea of really being strategic about it. And so is that something that a grant writer within an organization or even a grant writing consultant are they the ones doing that? Or is that somebody, you know, in a more senior leadership position at the organization who's kind of spearheading that effort?
I like to see it led from the grant writer themselves, whether they're in-house or they're a freelancer. This is not a skill that even requires grant writing knowledge. It's critical thinking. It's critical thinking and research. And it's very learnable. So I'll give an example of its efficacy. We had a gal, Jane, she works for a fire department in rural Washington, really broke, small little town. And she had applied, I hope I can get all my numbers right. She'd applied for something like 42 grants the year before she joined us. And she had won one of them worth $5,000. So she was obviously feeling pretty crushed, because she had just applied for absolutely anything that would pass through her desk. So after we showed her how to not do that, focus on the handful of grants that are worth it and put more effort into them, she ended up applying for 11 grants. So we're now looking at a fraction of the original list, and she'd already secured 1.5 million from that, including supporting other fire districts in the county. And so it just goes to show, like, that turnaround was transformative, and that happened in a year. Just by learning about a funding strategy. That's it. Like, learning how to research the grants, focus on the right ones, make a plan, and stop that cycle of chasing the grants haphazardly.
That's amazing. That's like work smarter, not harder. I feel like that perfectly describes that. And it's also like the opposite of like the spray and pray method of just like doing everything and hoping that one is going to land. And that's really interesting, because I'm sure people have heard before related to grants that it's just a numbers game. Just get as many applications out there as you can, and like then you have a better chance of getting them. But I think that example proves that, like, actually, no, that's not the way to win more grants.
That can be a more damaging approach. When you just throw in an application that's poorly put together, your name is still attached to that. That is still your brand. That is still what you're then known for. That's going to influence the next proposal that comes in next year, right? And so we want to be putting forth great work. We want to communicate professionally. We want to be building a relationship with them through the year. And you can only manage so many relationships in a year. And so we're so much better served to focus on the ones that really truly feel aligned, and that we have the time and the energy to really build, versus, yes, this, like you said, the spray and pray.
I don't know where that came from. That sounds like, I don't know what the original meaning of that was, but like I've heard it used before. Anyway, so in terms of thinking, working smarter and being more strategic and being more focused to really put your best foot forward in the work that does go out into the world, I know that you are starting to experiment with ChatGPT inside your business. And I would love to just hear a little bit more about what you're doing with ChatGPT, how it impacts the writing profession, the grant writing profession. Just tell us a little bit more about what you're doing.
Absolutely. So I was really fired up about this in December when ChatGPT was really sort of hitting mainstream media. And I worked with the developer to say, hey, what if we partner? Like, we help our grant writers implement this technology to write their grant applications better and faster. Because one of the hardest things to do is get that first draft completed. Once you have a first draft, there's words on the paper. It's so much simpler to work with. And that ended up not flowing. And so I found another developer to work with, And I thought, okay, well, let's just step back and build a newsletter so we can all just stay up to speed on where this technology is going, because every week it feels like there's something new that's coming out. And I will be completely honest with you, it has not flown as easily as I expected. The newsletter copy, like the draft that I've been getting back, that is basically we're using ChatGPT to summarize all of the articles that we're pulling. And those summaries are terrible. Sometimes you're like, where did this even come from? And so I feel that often there's just this glorification of AI and ChatGPT, and it's going to get there. It's going to be amazing, but it's not to say that it's still not quite messy. And the other thing I reflected on quite recently was that I was like, why am I getting into this? Partly it's because I feel like are known as the modern grant writers. Like we're the ones that are always pushing the limits and want to know like what's around the corner. But I also, if I'm honest with myself and your listeners, it was from a place of fear. Am I going to get left behind? I'm still young in my career. If I don't understand how this works, am I going to be irrelevant, right? Someone else is going to beat me to it. So if I'm real, a lot of what was motivating me was not an expansive state of mind. It was from fear. And now that I've named that, I feel actually more comfortable moving forward because I'm removing the pressure that it becomes or does anything. And instead I'm viewing it with a state of curiosity, but not trying to force or need an outcome. And so that's where we stand with it now. Obviously, I hope by the time this airs that we have a working newsletter and we could throw it in your links. But for now, I don't. It's messy, but I also think that messiness is what we need to be talking about.
I love that because I also kind of had that same realization last week because I've been playing around with it as well for a lot of different things, just like, okay, let's see what this thing can do. And what I realized, I was like, okay, this actually isn't, I don't think it's going to replace anybody. To me, I look at it as like a faster, more efficient search engine. But what's missing is like the story. Like if I am, if I'm writing something, like I've been using it to kind of brainstorm some ideas and like outlines for my book. Well, ChatGPT can't write my own story for me. Like I still have to go in there and do that. Can it help me with talking points related to a specific kind of like tactical subject and give me like 5 bullet points? Yes. And that's super helpful because now I don't have to write that. But what it's not going to do is write my story. And I don't know. So like, I've been kind of coming to the same realization that like, yeah, it's helpful, but it's not everything. And I don't think it's going to replace, like, it's not going to fully replace me or my work or you or your work. So, so that's interesting. And I can't wait to see like what your newsletter turns out to be. So are you trying to have it write you like an entire newsletter? You give it some prompts and it writes the whole thing?
Essentially, I hate research, which is a little ironic for a grant writer. And so I don't like to look at a screen longer than I need to. And so I was hoping it would shortcut that work for me, right? Go gather all the latest information, give me the summary. I will distill that and I will share that. But the original was actually, can we build our own data informed model? Because I have 500 grant writers, have them upload their grants. So we can actually, because the thing about ChatGPT is it's built on, I think it's 2021 data and behind, right? So it's not actually gathering information in the last couple of years. And so I was like, can we build our own proprietary data set essentially so that it's getting to know what does a successful grant narrative look like? So it's even smarter, right? And that is possible. But the other thing is what we have today, ChatGPT 3 is how it's like 170 million data points. I'm sure I'm goofing my numbers, but that it pulls from to be able to give an answer. ChatGPT 4 is projected to be many multiples over that. And so once you start having more and more data points, then it becomes more refined, more accurate, et cetera. And so that's why, yes, it's okay right now to say, I don't think it's going to write my story, et cetera, but it's not very far away where really it can help. Maybe you're just audio recording it and then it's helping you digest that onto paper, right? So that's part of the reason why I'm trying to just slow down, learn as much as we can with this newsletter, gather information, because I'm actually more curious about ChatGPT 4, because I think that's going to be a breakaway moment.
So interesting. I didn't really know, like, I definitely do not follow like tech stuff. So I've just been playing around with it, but I didn't know a version 4 was coming
Oh,
with
it's not really like
that.
public or whatever. I mean, I think it'd be like a year out, right? Like we don't know when that would come, but now the race is on, right? Like Google with
Sure.
their Bard and et cetera. So, I mean, I've pretty much, I feel like I'm sharing all like the best I have right now. And there's not really much more we can talk about on it, but I will say that it's a space that will continue to evolve, and the speed at which it evolves will increase. And we all know that because we live in a world with, hello, like look at your phones from just the last 20 years, right? Like this is
Mhm.
the world we live in. And I do think navigating our own mindset issues around it is really vital so that we can embrace something and not doing it from a place of fear, because otherwise like we're only going to have inherent resistance. So even if we don't use it today and we don't use it for a while, like the day will come where we're using it, and there will come the day when we can't imagine our life without it, because that we imagine our lives without our phones now, right?
Yeah.
So I think just there's some sort of surrender to that without feeling like you have to be the first one out the gate. And the other point I'll share on this is I grew up on a cattle ranch in Wyoming. We were the last ranchers, I swear, to switch from pitching hay loosely with a team of horses, a team of work horses pulling the hay, right? You should have seen my abs. So we would be pitching off all hay for 500-600 cattle. And we were the last ones to move to baling, round baling. But because we were so late of technology adopters, the technology had been highly refined. So we had just a Cadillac tractor, makes those bales perfectly, versus everyone else that had rougher technology because they adopted sooner. And so we have to remember, you don't always have to be the person that's on the front end of it. I think I'm kind of curious on this one. Maybe I want to be out in front on it, but it's also okay to be a late adopter. You're not going to necessarily get left behind. You're going to get the Cadillac experience. So that's just something I think to process and think about, because I think sometimes our fear of missing out or fear of being left behind can outweigh really being the right time for us as individuals.
Yeah, I think that's such a good, I really like that analogy. I think that's such a good point. Let the kinks get worked out, and then you jump in when the technology is refined and it's maybe easier to use, or it's more accurate, it's whatever. I like that. I like that analogy a lot. Um, Tell us about, you have written a book and you are working right now at the time of recording, you're working on the audio version of that book, but can you tell us about your book?
Yes, it's How to Write a Grant, Become a Grant Writing Unicorn. I wrote the first edition a couple of years ago by, actually, now that we're talking about hacks, I outlined and then audio recorded the chapter, transcribed it with a friend that coded me a piece of software that would transcribe it. Now you can just go do that online cheaply. And then I edited that version. And so when I wrote the second edition, I did the same thing. I went to this remote village in Alaska. I literally just hiked and wrote and slept and transcribed audio into the book. So I wrote this whole thing in seriously 7 days and published it a month later. So it's amazing what, just to your point of like what's possible even without AI, right? I guess the book is basically, the first third is about the top 10 questions I would get asked as a grant writer. So right off the bat, whatever your question is, what does the funder want to hear? How do you write a grant, right? I answer all of that. Then I answer the top 10 questions I wish you were asking, the ones that a new grant writer or someone that's in the space maybe isn't thinking about, but you would be well served to think about. And then the third section, which is the new part of the second edition, was all of the mindset stuff that I did not fully appreciate. And probably the biggest point I make in there is about the Dunning-Kruger effect. Have you heard of that?
I've not, no.
Okay, it's game changing. So essentially the idea is when we start something new, we're actually highly confident, but we're low in competence. And then once we realize how much we don't know, our confidence plummets and we're still pretty incompetent. Then that's where most people either get kicked out of programs at their lowest point, or you give up because it just feels insurmountable. But for those that stick with it, and this is where we have a lot of interventions, because this occurs for most people between month 4 and 6, then it's like, okay, you can climb out of this to gain confidence and competence to the full grant writing unicorn status. But once you reflect on anything new you've learned, anything new, you can see this pattern happens. And when we become adults, often we haven't learned something new in a while, and we forget that process, and we expect ourselves to be good at something right off the bat, right? I'm super guilty of this at times too. And so understanding that principle and how it works and helping us just embrace that has been game changing for bringing more people into the profession that maybe otherwise would have dropped off, not because they couldn't be great at it, but just because our mind got in the way.
Oh, I love that addition. I think that is huge. I can think of like I'm thinking because I'm writing a book as well. And so I feel like I'm at that point where I had the idea, I got started. I'm like, oh, this is going to be awesome. I'm so excited. Then I'm like, oh, what was I thinking? Who am I to be writing this book? I don't know how to do this. I don't know. I can't do this. But I had never heard of that. What was it called? I didn't write it down.
The
Dunning something.
Yeah, the Dunning-Kruger effect. We have a whole
Okay.
chart for it. We call it the Dunning-Kruger effect on unicorns. Like it's it's great. And it's wonderful because now our members will reference it. They're like, I'm in the valley of despair. Can I get a pep talk to help me get out of it? And like everyone will rally in the community group for them and get them going. And so it's just amazing to understand these underlying principles that I think sometimes we fight against when we don't realize like these are human nature cycles. Like life is nothing but a bunch of patterns. And we either see the pattern and make peace with it, or we make war with a pattern because we don't understand it and we just fight it. So the more that we can see these patterns, this is another ranching analogy. So essentially I was out in the hay fields, 14 years old. It was my first year. Again, we're putting up hay loose, right? Like it's this old school process. It has not changed in 100 years. And I was the raker. So I'm like raking the hay after it's been cut into windrows. And I kept getting caught up by the stacking crew. So I was holding them up. And my dad came over to me and he said, Meredith, you've got to look in the hay for the patterns. Make each move count. And when I started looking ahead, what if I made this turn instead of that turn? I started to pull ahead because I wasn't just doing the job. I was looking for a pattern. I was making each move count. And we can do the same thing in our jobs. We can roll into our day and let the day hit us, or we can look forward and say, what pattern do I want to create with my week, right? What are my deep work days? What are my days that I connect with people, right? So we can create patterns and look ahead and anticipate it and make each move count, or we can just get steamrolled by it and others catch up to you and you feel like you're on the heels all the time. So it's just a really useful way to think about, like, we can get ahead of things if we're just even looking ahead. All we have to do is look for a pattern.
I love that. And I feel like, nonprofit leaders are just really burnt out. And it's probably because, at least in part, we're just letting our days and our weeks and our months and our years just steamroll us versus being intentional about looking ahead and finding those patterns. And I love that. I'm definitely going to look up that principle because, again, if you know what's coming, you can anticipate it and help yourself kind of get through it before it just runs you over. I really like that. So where can we find your book, first of all, the actual like paper book? I see it's on Amazon.
Yep.
Is that where we should go to grab it?
Noble, or if you want to support your local bookstore, which always is a plus, you could ask them to order it in for you. And yeah, I think what you might be jumping to next is I'm actually working on recording the audiobook right now, which is so fun. And so that'll be out, who knows, pretty soon. Definitely by the time, we'll have it linked below, but I'm excited about that because if people are listening to a podcast, you obviously like to listen and learn. And I had a lot of fun with the audiobook. I'm being I think I took the first one a little too seriously, like you're supposed to sound a certain way. And now that I've listened to more audiobooks and I realize the ones I most love, it just feels like you're having a conversation. It's way more playful. I even added in a few things like, hey, ChatGPT didn't exist when I was writing this chapter. So here's my 2 thoughts on that. Like, who knows if that's even allowed, but I did it. So yeah, I'm really pumped about it. It'll be a great book. I'm excited to get it out.
That's awesome. And I love the fact that it basically started out as an audiobook and then you translated that into a paper book and now it's going back to audio. That's such a brilliant way. Now I'm like, okay, I'm getting on my treadmill with a voice recorder. And that's how I'm doing this book because staring at like a blank screen and a blinking cursor is like hell. So I'm doing that. That's a great idea.
I believe truly at this point, you could write your book in a couple of days, especially if you were to go treat yourself to even like, can I get away? Can I do a little mini escape? And you do nothing else but do that. And frankly, whether we're talking about writing a book or just for your listeners doing anything of meaning, grant writing requires deep work. Grant writing, I advise the same tip. Like if you have someone that has the scope of work and you can't get them to sit still and give you advice and give you what you need, well, go in with the recorder and let them just say it. And then you transcribe it and rework it. So there's a number of ways you can hack this so that we can all just write faster, because that first version is the hardest and then it's better from there.
Yeah. Exactly. I love that. Okay. Before we wrap up, I need to ask you the question that I ask all of our guests. What does a prosperous nonprofit look like to you?
All right, I'm ready. A prosperous nonprofit has spaciousness. What I mean by that is that it's not chaos every day. People can come in feeling refreshed. You know what you're doing. It's high impact. You live by Pareto's principle, right? The 80-20 rule. So that you're courageous in dropping the things that no longer serve you and focus on just that, which you are the absolute best suited to do. And that allows for spaciousness. It won't always be spacious, but on the whole, if it is, that's a viable, prosperous nonprofit.
So beautiful. I could not agree with that more. And that's what I try to achieve in my business as well, is spaciousness rather than continuously chasing the inbox, chasing the task list, really building space. And that's when I feel like I have my best ideas and do my best work. So I love that. Okay. Thank you so much, Meredith. I loved this conversation. Where can our listeners find out more about Learn Grant Writing, about all the things? Where do we find you?
All right. It's going to be very easy. LearnGrantWriting.org. So you can go to our website, grantwriting.org. There's a free grant writing class. That's a solid starting point for anyone that's, even if you've been in this space for a while. I have a free budget template in there that I think is worth its weight in gold. Yeah, you would love that, right?
Yes.
So that was probably a good starting point. Our YouTube channel is pretty bumping as well. And so, yeah, I think that's where I would start.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I'm like, okay, I just typed Learn Grant Writing into Google, and obviously you were the #1 result. I was like, well, that's a brilliant business name, because that's a very Googleable term. And there you are right at the top.
Yes. I know we keep thinking we need a real name, but we can't figure one out. So we just keep going with the domain.
Yeah. I mean, to type a phrase into Google and you're the first result, I think that's a keeper. Amazing. Also awesome. LearnGrantWriting.org. Definitely go check out Meredith and her team and their work if you are interested in learning grant writing. Meredith, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. All right. Talk to you later.